Canadians gathered across the country at cenotaphs today to honor the fallen and to honor those who served in uniform. Prime Minister Stephen Harper and his wife Laureen attended the remembrance ceremony at the National War Memorial here in Ottawa. Before we get to our MPs, I want to show you some of those highlights. Check this out.
Go on, reload.
If you ever come to Ottawa, I would urge you to attend that on Remembrance Day. Most of us here, we go out to that, to watch that extraordinary tribute. It's very solemn. There's lots of political debates here in Ottawa, but at those moments, everybody comes together. It's one of the most moving ceremonies here in the country, and it takes place at the National War Memorial there. I should say that as people were honoring the vets today, of course, some were mobilizing. The Disaster Assistance Relief Team, 40 members, are mobilizing now at a C-17 in Trenton, and within the hour, they'll be taking off to the Philippines to help those in need of that super typhoon and the victims there, which is an extraordinary disaster. Within an hour, the advance team that goes there to assess, there'll be 8 people on the ground in the Philippines, 8 Canadians, within the hour. So that's going on as the solemn tributes to veterans happen here. Meantime, beneath the tributes and around the ceremony, veterans, some of them are incredibly angry, and some have been very outspoken even today on Remembrance Day to say the federal government is turning its back on veterans, from inadequate benefits for the wounded to shutting down service centers that help veterans. Are the needs of those who served in uniform being neglected? Does Canada have an obligation to do more? Joining me now is Erin O'Toole, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade and a veteran himself. Jack Harris is the NDP's National Defence Critic, and the Liberal Veterans Affairs Critic is Jim Karygiannis. Gentlemen, good to see you. We will talk politics today. I should just say, having all of us, I'm sure, attended ceremonies to honor veterans, is a day of unity on one hand, Erin O'Toole. I mean, obviously you're a veteran, that means a lot to you. And yet there's some fundamental concerns, Mr. O'Toole, about whether it's the impending closure of 9 Veteran Affairs offices, whether it's money to bury vets, whether it's ongoing questions about the new Veterans Charter. How would you characterize the relationship between veterans and this government?
I think it's a good one, Evan, and I say that as not only a veteran myself, but we have the largest number of veterans in the House in our caucus, and we talk about these issues regularly. And in many ways, since forming government, we are spending almost $5 billion more on veterans, and our operational budget is over $700 million more per year than when we assumed office. But more importantly, we're also trying to do things better. We're serving our traditional veterans, World War II and Korean War veterans. This year is the year of the Korean War veteran, which is an important move by our government. And we're trying to serve modern veterans, veterans from the Cold War, our Afghan vets, and give the flexibility into the system to serve veterans in new ways and in some of the traditional ways as well.
Erin O'Toole, one of the new ways is to serve veterans through 600 Service Canada locations and serve veterans online. To do that, the government has decided to close down 9 locations where vets go. Now, the criticism has been that PSAC, the Service Canada, that they simply don't have the training to deal with these vets, and that the veterans, many of them who are older, don't want to use these locations. How does your government justify the closure of these 9 offices?
Well, some of these offices, Evan, are actually not used as much as they were years ago. In some cases, a dozen or a few visits per day. And those offices really were there decades ago when there weren't government offices like Service Canada throughout the country. So in Nova Scotia, I attended the PSAC conference and spoke to Mr. Clark, a veteran from Nova Scotia who was concerned. There was 3 Veterans Affairs offices, but over 30 Service Canada offices. So my pledge to him at that meeting was I was going to take back and speak to the minister about making sure the other PSAC members working in the Service Canada offices have the appropriate training. It's also critical to remember, Evan, that if there's a seriously immobilized veteran, one of our older veterans that has mobility issues or a new one with some disabilities, a caseworker can go to their home. So it's not just about doing things.
Yeah, but that only, frankly, that only applies with veterans who have case managers. If you don't have a case manager, you don't get that service. Is that right?
Generally, yes. Generally, the only people going more regularly to one of those offices, Evan, would be somebody who has their file case managed. Most veterans, like myself and most of the people that I served with that are starting to get out, they see a case manager when they transition, and most never again need to visit an office. And a lot of them from my generation do want to manage their own affairs, much like they might with other financial matters online or through the telephone. So we've got to build in enough flexibility. Like the area I represent in Ontario has over 400,000 people. It has not had a standalone veterans office for many, many years. So we've got to do an approach that works for the most number of veterans.
Let me get the opposition on. We'll start with this issue, the closure. Jack Harris, then Jim Karygiannis. What's your view of the closures of these offices? Is it a better way to serve veterans and younger veterans, or in your mind, is it alienating some veterans?
Clearly not. I mean, it's the veterans themselves that are complaining. I mean, if Aaron talks about a dozen or 2 visits a day, that's a dozen or 2 people who have one-on-one support, and this is obviously the low end. But these are very important to veterans to have that contact. Not everybody wants to. It's not a choice there of work going online or going on the telephone. People need that service. They want that service from people who are veterans affairs people. If you're going to add on, that'd be great. Add on and have extra services in other places, but to take away what's there, that's not a good thing. That's not progress, and people are alienated by it. The veterans themselves don't want it. It's not about the PSAC members, it's about serving veterans.
Jim Karygiannis, your view on that?
Let's talk about some figures. 26,788 veterans are being affected. In Sydney, Nova Scotia alone, 4,200 veterans have been affected, and 3,200 veterans were out in Sydney, Nova Scotia just a couple of days ago saying to the minister, come and talk to us. And the challenge went out to the minister, come and speak to the veterans and look them in the eyes. I mean, I can appreciate what Mr. O'Toole is saying, and I can appreciate the whole fact that, you know, there's 600 points of contact. You get an 80-year-old that has got a case manager, and you get an 80-year-old that needs to go in Windsor. Windsor office is going to close. She's going to have to drive 2.5 hours. Can that 80-year-old drive at 2.5 hours during the winter? Can even the younger vets that have been affected pick up the number, they got post-traumatic stress disorder, pick up the phone and dial 1 or 2 or 3 in order to get through? And when they get through, they got O Canada Line. O Canada Line, those people are not trained in order to deal with this. So these centres have to remain open, and they have to service the men that served us.
All right, there's another issue I want to pick up on, which is the Veterans Charter, because the Veterans Affairs Ombudsman, who's been on this program most recently to talk about his new report into the new Veterans Charter, and he raised concerns about 400 permanently incapacitated veterans. And I want to read a quotation, Mr. O'Toole, from the key findings. It says here, when these veterans lose their Veterans Affairs Canada extended earnings loss benefit at the age of 65, they will experience a significant reduction in monthly income support. These most vulnerable, seriously disabled veterans are at risk of living their retirement years with insufficient income to sustain their pre-age 65 standard of living. In fact, some veterans are at risk of living their retirement years below the poverty level. Now, I know Minister Fantino is doing a review of the new Veterans Charter. Can you tell me specifically what changes the government is looking at to improve the benefits for these veterans?
Well, Ivan, the Ombudsman report showed that there is a group of veterans, approximately 400, that when some of their existing benefits end at 65, they don't have enough superannuation time in their pension to make the difference negligible. And the minister has already said that is specifically going to be looked at as part of an overall examination of the new Veterans Charter. The new Veterans Charter was brought in by the Martin government and implemented by ours. It was reviewed once already when the lump sum payment was allowed as a lump sum or as an annuity over time. We've also created 2 new benefits for seriously injured veterans in terms of supplements to bring their income up to a level because they may not be able to transition to employment after the military. And we're committed to looking at a system that takes care of the veteran from the time they serve right through to the end of their life. And in fact, the Ombudsman report did say that some of the changes, including some of the new benefits we brought in a few years ago, will actually pay more benefits, more financial assistance to some veterans seriously injured in, say, their mid-20s, right through to 65.
Right.
More money
Although
there.
there is a BC class action case that the government's
which the
appealing
government
on that.
appealed.
Yeah, sorry, Jim Karygiannis, then
Well,
Jack
I mean, the government
Harris.
appealed and it says you cannot go forward. I mean, they didn't want the judge to allow the Equitas people to go forward, and the government appealed. Now, in all due respect, Mr. O'Toole, in all due respect, you sitting there and saying that what we have right now is better than what we had before, giving somebody a lump sum, and I will quote the folks from Wounded Soldier that said that's like hanging a case of beer in front of a drunk. A lot of our young men and women that are injured come back and they get the lump sum, they go and spend it, either trying to buy a house or buying a fast car or spending it on booze or addiction, and after a couple of years they're left to fend for themselves.
Sorry, just explain that, because that's a pretty, just to talk about veterans like that, and I appreciate there's a lot of criticism about the lump sum, but why? What is the criticism that they'll spend it like a drunk? I don't get that.
Scott Maxwell, Wounded Soldier, the executive director, is saying giving a lump sum to a wounded soldier is like hanging a beer in front of a drunk. A case of beer in front of a drunk.
I get it.
And those people who squandered it, they will foolishly spend it away, because a lot of the young men and women will buy a fast car. There was a case where a young man bought a fast car. He took it on the base, whipped it around twice, and he got into an accident. And there's young men and women right now that served. Mike Behalvanian, he is in an institution back in BC. I visited him last week. He's homeless. So for people to stand there and saying that that we're going to examine the new Veterans Charter and we're going to go forward and all that stuff. Listen, we all voted for the NVC. We were told it's going to be the best thing since apple pie and ice cream. We were fooled. It's time to make changes. And if you really want to change it, you wouldn't have prorogued the House and not called us back in order for us to do it. And you would not be wanting to, to review the Charter if it wasn't. You would not have reviewed it if it wasn't from the screaming of the Ombudsman. Come on, now let's be real and let's be honest about it.
Jack Harris. Jack Harris, I want Mr. O'Toole to respond, but Jack Harris first. What's your view then on this lump sum issue and the extended benefits that we're just talking about?
I think it's been a terrible problem. You look at the BC case, the government took the position before the case, even though they lost the first round, was that they had no legal obligation to veterans, that this was something that they were doing on their own. That came as a great shock, I think, to the veterans of this country who were promised, and when they went to Afghanistan, for example, that if they were wounded and as a result of battle, that they would have support, that they would be supported. The lump sum issue, there's countless numbers of veterans have received lump sums and that were inadequate to solve their problems. Some, in the case of an individual getting a significant lump sum, it ended up going into their house, not into their long-term income. You can't solve that by transferring a lump sum into an annuity. There's not enough money involved. Then people want to go back to the pensions. If they're disabled, they want to have something to replace the income that they're losing over time. We get it time and time again, where people are $5
or 6 years of their payroll,
and that's not enough money to substitute for a pension. So it's inadequate. It can't be transferred into annuity. We've got to go look at a system for earnings loss, and that has to come.
Last question on this. So there's one more issue I want to very quickly cover. Mr. O'Toole, can you respond to that?
Well, Evan, clearly Jack did recognize in that last statement that a few years ago the government, in the last review, allowed for an option to take the lump sum or take an annuity. I'll actually remind the gentleman, Jim referenced the fact he voted for the new Veterans Charter. A lot of veterans were asking for more upfront in terms of some sort of lump sum. That's what led to it. And I wouldn't compare it to a case of beer. I think particularly on a day like this, I think that's a totally inappropriate comment.
Speak to Scott Maxwell from Wounded Soldier.
I know Scott well, he's from my area, and I've worked in this area, Jim. Soldiers, there may be some that have issues, but they look at these things very seriously. A lot of them are fathers. They're providing for their families.
This is serious
so to talk
business,
about it like that is irresponsible.
There
are also supplemental benefit reserve payments that are there for our veterans beyond the lump sum.
There's a lot of politics around veterans. We've covered it for years. Privacy issues, the new Veterans
Leaking of
Charter,
files.
a lot of issues. This, of course, on a day like today, we're all coming together in one sense, but we're also talking about these fundamental issues that are affecting veterans. Aaron O'Toole, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade, and a veteran himself, Jack Harris, the NDP's National Defence Critic, and Liberal Veterans Affairs Critic Jim Karygiannis. Gents, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Evan.
We got lots more.